Speaking of questions, we've been getting a lot about contact tracing. It's part of Oregon's reopening plan, of course. These tracers are basically people who try to find everyone who might have been in contact with an infected person so that they can tell them to self-quarantine and not get anybody else sick. But right now, Multnomah County says they don't have enough contact tracers to start reopening or even apply. So Terry asked me, what skill set is required to be a contact tracer, and what is the difficulty in filling the required number of positions? So we asked Multnomah County, and basically the problem is they haven't even posted the jobs yet. Why? Well, they tell us that they have been busy training about 45 people who are already working for the county to become contact tracers. They say that they'll start to look for outside candidates in the coming weeks. All right, they want to hire eventually 120 people. So what qualifications do you need? Mostly people skills, like good customer service type stuff, and people who can, as they put it, navigate challenging conversations about people's health. So that translates to good communication skills, in my opinion. We have more questions about this, though, like why not hire and train everybody all at the same time? Remember, we need 105 tracers just to submit the request to reopen. And why does it take weeks to train for a position like that? We didn't really get an answer to that question. I don't get it. I want to get it. So we're going to keep trying to get those answers so we can all get it.